Welcome to the Depth Dive. We cut through the noise, get straight to the sources. Today we're tackling a really dark moment in early American history, the Salem witch trials of 1692. And our mission, essentially, is to dig into the sources to answer that incredibly tough question. Why? Why did the Salem community hunt witches? Why turn on neighbors like that?
It's a fundamental question, and look, if you're trying to get your head around this maybe for an essay or just to understand it, the absolute first thing is realizing there's no single, simple answer. The sources really push us towards what historians call a multi-causal approach.
Yeah.
You absolutely have to look at the religious world, the social tensions, what was happening militarily, even, believe it or not, environmental factors. They all kind of slam together at once.
And the outcome, the sheer human cost, just highlights how intense those pressures were. I mean, we're talking about a massive, terrifying spike. In just that 1 year, 1692, Puritan authorities executed 19 people. Several others died in jail. And that's just completely off the charts compared to the 60 years before that, where only 16 people in total had been executed for witchcraft across all the colonies. Something snapped, didn't it?
It really did. And to understand that snap, you have to start where their world started, with their faith. These were deeply, intensely pious Puritan families. They came to the New World specifically to build this city upon a hill, right? A perfect model of Reformed Protestantism. God's authority was meant to be absolute.
Yeah, this wasn't just Sunday morning faith. It was the operating system for their entire lives. And built into that system was this powerful belief in the supernatural. Crucially, they saw Satan not as some abstract idea, but as a real, active offensive force.
Exactly. And that active belief, that's what really enabled the trials to happen. Because they truly believed, they lived under this covenant with God, any misfortune, a cow getting sick, a child dying, a bad harvest, wasn't just bad luck. It was immediately seen as either God showing his displeasure or Satan actively interfering in their lives. So witches, they were terrifyingly real agents of the devil, people who'd supposedly made a pact to carry out evil deeds and deliberate harm.
Right, so if your crops failed or your kid got sick, you weren't thinking about bacteria or weather patterns first. You were thinking, who around here signed the devil's book?
Precisely. And unfortunately, this worldview carried a heavy gender bias. The sources are pretty clear. Women were seen as the weaker vessel, more susceptible to the devil because of their supposedly weaker natures. That was the common European view they brought with them. It fostered this environment of constant vigilance, looking inward for corruption.
And they had a track record of intolerance, didn't they? Thinking back to earlier dissenters like Roger Williams or Anne Hutchinson, if you stepped outside that very narrow religious path, the consequences were severe. Banishment was common. So if they'd cast out fellow devout Puritans for disagreeing on theology, imagine how they'd react to someone they suspected of actually partnering with the devil.
That intense religious framework was like dry tinder, absolutely ready to catch fire. But other things were happening that basically fanned the flames. We absolutely have to talk about the massive instability coming from outside their immediate community, especially the conflicts on the frontier.
You mean King Philip's War? That had happened maybe 15, 20 years earlier, 1675, 76. That war was just devastating, wasn't it? Sources say something like half the Puritan towns on the frontier were wiped out, people lost everything, became refugees. The fear must have been immense.
It was immense, and it connects directly. Many of the accusers in 1692, or their families, had personally experienced that trauma. They were veterans or survivors of these brutal native wars. So the whole community was already living with this background radiation of trauma, this heightened sense of alertness and security. When you have a population dealing with that level of collective PTSD, frankly, they're just prone to more hysteria. They're already braced for the next disaster.
And it wasn't just the trauma of war. The whole political situation was a mess too, right? The sources mention unprecedented political and cultural changes. For anyone not deep into 17th century history, this part's maybe a bit obscure, but sounds really important.
Oh, it's crucial. You had the chaos after the Glorious Revolution back in England, and the collapse of this thing called the Dominion of New England. The short version is, for years leading right up to 1692, the Massachusetts government was in limbo. They didn't have a proper royal charter, no officially recognized governor. It was makeshift.
Okay, so think about that. You're a community that believes your whole society is based on God's authority, but your actual earthly government, the structure you rely on day to day, is unstable, maybe even illegitimate in some eyes. Laws are fuzzy, courts are temporary.
Exactly. And when people feel that kind of deep uncertainty about authority, about the very rules of their world, what do? Often they fall back hard on their most fundamental beliefs. In Salem, that meant doubling down on the reality of Satan and witchcraft. It became the explanation for why their world felt like it was changing and falling apart amidst all this political and military instability. The lack of earthly control somehow made the supernatural threat feel even bigger.
Okay, so we've got the intense religious belief, the frontier trauma, the political vacuum. That's the primed environment. What was the actual spark? How did it all ignite in Salem Village?
Well, the sources point to some initial real events. It seems to center around a group of young women, including the daughter and niece of the local minister, Samuel Parris. They were apparently spending time with Tituba, an enslaved woman Parris owned, who was from the Caribbean, probably Barbados. And they were doing things in the kitchen.
Things like what? The sources mention fortune-telling, maybe? Practices that the Puritans would have seen as dabbling in the forbidden, right? Like folk magic or something near voodoo, or maybe even a Wiccan nature worship type thing?
Something along those lines. Whatever it was specifically, the Puritan authorities immediately saw it as dangerous, illicit contact with the spirit world. They labeled it genuine witchcraft. This wasn't just abstract fear anymore. It was a concrete event, young women doing things the church strictly forbade.
And then those girls started having fits. Screaming, convulsions, things that look terrifying.
Yes. And whether those symptoms were genuinely supernatural or perhaps psychosomatic or maybe even linked to something else entirely we'll get to, that the Puritan framework instantly provided the answer. They were being afflicted. Witches were harming them.
And once that idea took hold that witches were actively hurting people within the community, the accusations started flying. But they weren't random, were they? This is where the internal community tensions really come into play.
Absolutely not random. This is a huge piece of the puzzle if you're trying to explain the scale of it. Salem Village wasn't some harmonious little place. It was deeply divided. You had long-standing friction between Salem Town, the more prosperous, merchant-run port, and Salem Village, which was poorer, more agricultural, and full of its own internal squabbles.
And the early accusations seemed to target people already on the margins, right? Beggars, older women, people who didn't quite fit in. But then it spread. The sources talk about accusations becoming a way to settle old scores, like the townies or the established popular girls pointing fingers at the rural girls or rural folk they already disliked. There was clearly underlying animosity.
Definitely.
Oh.
It suggests that once the door was open for accusations, once the system allowed it, all those simmering resentments over land boundaries, church politics, family reputations, social status, they found a deadly outlet. Accusing someone of witchcraft became a weapon in existing community conflicts. Just a spiral. Neighbor turning against neighbor. You're a witch. No, you're a witch.
It's just chilling. So those are the sort of immediate social, political, religious factors. But historians have also dug deeper, proposing some broader theories about what 1692 really meant. Let's touch on the gender backlash idea.
Right. This theory suggests that, maybe subconsciously, the trials were partly about pushing back against women's roles. A kind of really strong tender of anti-woman feeling, as one source puts it. The argument is that it wasn't just about religion, it was also about social control.
How so? The idea being that women, maybe out of necessity because of the wars and instability, were becoming more independent, managing farms, handling finances while men were away or had died?
Possibly. Women taking on more responsibility, managing property, maybe becoming more visible in community affairs, and perhaps that rising independence felt threatening to the very strict patriarchal structure of Puritan society. So in this view, the witch hunt becomes a brutal way to keep that in check, to reassert the traditional old European identity of a submissive woman through fear and violence, the backlash.
Fascinating and disturbing. Then there's that other theory, the one that sounds almost like science fiction, the environmental explanation.
Ah, yes, the ergot theory. This one got a lot of attention, particularly when it was proposed back in the 1960s. It focuses on the physical symptoms of the afflicted girls. The idea is ergot, which is a fungus, a mold, that can grow on rye grain, especially after a damp growing season, which 1692 apparently was.
And ergot has chemical properties.
It does. It contains lysergic acid related to LSD. If people ate contaminated rye bread, the theory goes, they could have experienced very real, very frightening physical and neurological symptoms. Things like convulsions, muscle spasms, hallucinations, that feeling of bugs crawling on the skin. Symptoms that actually line up pretty closely with some of the descriptions from 1692. People might literally have been, well, spazzing out and tripping, as one source rather bluntly puts it.
So that could explain the initial physical trigger for some of the girls, even if the mass hysteria that followed was purely social and religious.
That's the hypothesis. It's controversial, historians debate it, but it's an attempt to find a biological root for at least part of the phenomenon, suggesting maybe not everything started with purely psychological or spiritual causes.
Whatever the exact mix of causes, the end of the crisis is almost as striking as its beginning. It burned incredibly hot, but also burned out relatively quickly. After 1692, the executions just stopped. Dead halt. Not one more person killed for witchcraft after that year. What happened?
It seems the community, or at least the authorities, reached a breaking point. They realized they had, as one source says, lost the part of it, gone too far. You see evidence of a collective recoil, a genuine come-to-Jesus moment, if you will. People started to question the spectral evidence, the reliance on visions and dreams.
And there were apologies later, weren't there? Official acknowledgments of error.
Yes, eventually. Years later, there were public apologies, some restitution made to families, formal written apologies acknowledging they had completely lost their way as human beings.
It seems the sheer horror and injustice of 1692 finally shocked the system into recognizing its own delusion and ending the practice of witch hunting for good in colonial America. So bringing it back to our original mission, helping someone prepare, perhaps, for that essay on why Salem hunted witches, the absolute key takeaway from the sources is you have to argue it was multi-causal. There was this toxic brew, the intense Puritan faith and fear of Satan, layered with the trauma of frontier war, mixed with political chaos, and then ignited by internal social conflicts and maybe even biological triggers, all hitting at once.
Exactly. There's no single villain, no one cause. Salem shows us, I think, what can happen when fear takes over. Fear of the devil, fear of your neighbors, fear of change, fear of the unknown. It can lead a community to look for scapegoats, for explanations outside themselves, even if that process becomes completely irrational and self-destructive.
Which leads us to a final thought, something maybe to chew on. The sources mention how, during the peak of the hysteria, there were really no impartial observers. Everyone recording the events was in it. They were accusers, accused, judges, ministers, victims. They were all part of it. So consider this. How might that total lack of an outside perspective, that absence of any critical external viewpoint, have allowed the fear and delusion to spiral so rapidly and disastrously out of control? Something to think about.